15 quarterback rankings here. So the top 15 quarterbacks heading into the week. The first guy's Patrick Mahomes. And this guy, he's just the best of the best. Each and every week, he's putting up huge numbers. He's Mahomes for this Chief offense. And this week, he's got a matchup versus the Denver Broncos, where he only had 14 fantasy points versus his last matchup. And they still won that ball game 43-16. But Mahomes and Hill, they're on a tear of late, and I think Mahomes, he goes for a big ball game in this one, with Kansas City finally back at home this week. And I could see Mahomes going for 300 or 400 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns in this one. No one could stop him. He's on a mission, and this Chief team, they're trying to get a bye week. So you know they're going to try to win and try to score early and often. Number 2, Russell Wilson of the Seattle Seahawks. Russell Wilson, he hasn't been the same the last few weeks for whatever reason. This week he only had a 13-point fantasy day, is Wilson. We saw DK Metcalf get his, but besides that, no one else in the receiving or tight end position in Seattle didn't do anything in that ball game. On Monday Night Football, we saw Chris Carson have a good game and Carlos Hyde, but Wilson this week, I think he bounces back with the vengeance. He's got a great matchup versus the Giants. Seattle, another team, finally back at home after a few weeks now on the road. And I think Wilson, he could have that huge game like he's had early in the year, where he was scoring anywhere from 35 to 40 fantasy points. And I got him ranked number 2 this week and the rest of the season at quarterback. Number 3, Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers. Rodgers, people thought he was done. They drafted the rookie in the second round this year, but Rodgers, he's on a tear, and he's a dark horse candidate, in my opinion, for the MVP this year. Now he's got a good matchup. He's still home versus Philly. Philly, a lot of teams are throwing on him. Rodgers, he's got 30-plus fantasy points in his last 5 games, and no one's stopping him. Him and Davante Adams is a lethal combination. Those two guys are on the same page, and probably the best combination of quarterback to receiver in the league. Just the amount of years they've been doing it and the amount of stats and touchdowns they've been putting up. So I think versus Philly, another 30-plus easily for Aaron Rodgers and the Packers this week. Number 4, Big Ben Roethlisberger of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Big Ben had a mediocre to poor game in this Week 12 ball game that only happened 2 days ago. But now versus Washington, I think Ben, he gets back in the groove. Another home game here for Ben and the Steelers, and they want to send a message and keep that undefeated streak going here. I think Ben, he's going to get 25 to 35 fantasy point range in this ball game versus Washington. It's a great matchup on paper. He's got 3 great receivers, good running back. We don't know for Connor for sure if he's going to play. But anyway, Ben, they're clicking on all cylinders, and I expect a big bounce-back game in fantasy purposes for Ben. Number 5, Deshaun Watson of the Houston Texans. Watson, he's been great all season, but especially since Bill O'Brien's gone, his value's going to go down a little, I think, with Will Fuller out, but he still has some options. And Watson, he's a guy that makes players better around him. So I think Watson, he'll go down a little, maybe a point or 2 a game, but I don't think much. He makes plays. It don't matter who he versus. He plays indoors as well. And Brandon Cooks, I think he's still decent as a number 1 option and a number 1 receiver over there in Houston. So I could see Watson in this ball game versus a tough Indy team. I'm not going to say they're a bad defense, but I could still see him going for 250 to 300 yards and 2 or 3 touchdowns in this one. So he's number 5. Number 6, Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. Murray, he's been another MVP dark horse this season for the Cardinals. But Murray, sometimes he holds the ball too long. He throws the ball up for grabs at times. But this guy, he's still putting up huge fantasy numbers. Last week, though, a single-digit fantasy game for Murray, which was very surprising versus the New England Patriots in a ball game that the Cardinals lost. But Murray this week versus the Rams, I think he'll be pretty good. The Rams defense, they're still pretty tough and solid, even though San Francisco beat them in a shocker last week. But I think Kyler Murray, he'll be all right, and he'll have a top 6 performance. People might think he should be higher, but this week I'm going to be a little conservative with Murray, and his matchup is still tough. So I think at number 6 is a good spot to have him. Number 7, Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. He's number 7 for me because of this matchup versus a weak Dallas Cowboy defense that we saw Alex Smith just tear up and Antonio Gibson on Thanksgiving. This defense, for whatever reason this year, they're worse than last year, and that's hard to say. And Jackson, I think he could run wild in this ball game. Hopefully he's back, and he should be. And it's a must-win for Baltimore. So I think Baltimore, they're going to put the ball in Jackson's hand. He's going to have to make some big plays with his feet and his arm. And I could see him finally have that huge game and possibly his best fantasy game of the season this week versus a weak Dallas Cowboy defense. So I got Jackson at 7. Number 8, Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. Last week was one of the worst fantasy performances for Herbert, but he still went over 300 yards, and he had 2 touchdowns with a few turnovers in the game. This week he's got a pretty solid New England Patriot defense on target that he's versing, but Herbert, he's got a big arm, he's got a lot of good weapons there. Austin Eckler being back in the lineup is another great addition to that offense and a good weapon for him. And I think Herbert, he could get anywhere from 20 to 25 fantasy points. But these other guys have some better matchups in there this week, and that's why I got Herbert at 8. But the rest of the season, he's in the top 6 for me. Number 9, Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. Tannehill, he had a little bit of a slump, but now the last 2 weeks he's bounced back and he's looked good. He's getting everyone involved. Derrick Henry, he's taking off. And with teams loading the box, it's opening up the passing game more for Tannehill and this team. And this week they versus a Cleveland team that gives up a lot of fantasy points to quarterbacks. This week, Tannehill, I think 25 to 30 fantasy points is definitely in reach for him. And A.J. Brown's playing well. Corey Davis is doing good. Jonnu Smith's had a decent season. So he's got weapons and he's got the matchup. And I like him at number 9 here. Number 10, Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. Josh Allen, he's been pretty solid this season. He was a guy who was on a 4-week slump, but the last few weeks he's played well, except last week versus the Chargers. They did limit him to a decent amount, but this week he versus San Francisco, but it's going to be an indoor game because now San Francisco, like I keep mentioning, they're playing in Arizona, and we saw Allen the last time he went to Arizona have a huge fantasy ball game with, I believe, 45 fantasy points. So this week versus San Francisco, I could see Josh Allen have a pretty good game. I could see him get anywhere from 30 to 35 if he really explodes. But this week, I think they're going to keep him in check to a decency in San Francisco, and I could see him be on the down end, the 20 to 22 points. Number 11, Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. Cousins, this guy's really performed, and he's played well now the last few weeks since they've adjusted things after their bye week in Minnesota. They've won 4 out of 5. He's got a stud running back, 2 top 12 receivers on that offense, and Cousins, he's had great matchups as well. He's passed 30 fantasy points now in his last 2 weeks. This week versus Jacksonville, it's very possible he gets to the 30-point plateau, but this week I think it's going to be more of a Dalvin Cook type of game. But Cousins, I still think he'll get 20 plus in this one. But I'm just going off that Dalvin Cook is going to take over early and often and run out the clock by the end of the game. But Cousins, I think he goes for about 250 and 2 touchdowns in this one. Number 12, Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. Ryan's production most of the time has to do with Julio Jones, if he's playing or not. And it looks like he's going to be a true game-time decision, is Jones, unless the status changes here later in the day. But Ryan, a few weeks ago versus tough New Orleans defense, he was limited to about 12 fantasy points, I believe. And it was a tough game for him in the offense. This week, it's going to be another tough battle. See, the Saints, they're fighting for a bye and that second seed with Seattle and a few other teams. So the Saints, they're going to play hard. They're going to have to rely on their defense more now as the Saints, I believe, with Hill in their quarterback. And they know what Matt Ryan does, and the Saints usually have his number. So I'm going to be conservative with Ryan this week and have him at number 12. Number 13, Derek Carr, the Las Vegas Raiders. This is probably the last week I'm going to use Carr in fantasy. And last week he was an absolute disgrace at the quarterback position. Only 215 yards on Into and 3 fumble losses. So he had .60, and that's the worst of the worst. But this week he's got a good matchup versus the Jets. He's a guy, like I said, he's a 1-week streamer here, and this is probably his last best matchup of the year because he's a guy in my top 15 rest of the season rankings. Check that out for quarterbacks. He didn't crack The top 15 is Carr. So this week versus the Jets, I could see a good performance, 250 to 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. But after this week, I'm not going to use him. Number 14, Taysom Hill of the New Orleans Saints. This guy, he's a rushing touchdown machine. So every time they're at the goal line, it seems he's going to run in the end zone, and he's taking work from Kamara down there and Latavius Murray. Hill, we saw him have a 25-point fantasy day and a decent throwing ball game as well versus Atlanta. But last week versus Denver, I believe he only had 78 yards passing. It was more of a running game, and he had 2 running touchdowns. But Atlanta gives up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks, and this is why I got Hill here at 14. Plus, 2 weeks ago, he had a good fantasy day with 25 fantasy points. So he's 14, and the 15th and final guy is Philip Rivers at the Indianapolis Colts. Rivers, he's been playing well of late. This Colt team, they're still in the race. They're 7-4. They're playing well. And this week at Houston, I think Rivers, he's going to have a pretty decent game. The game's indoors, another nice indoor game. He's getting a rapport with Trey Burton, T.Y. Hilton, and Nyheim Hines out of the backfield. So Rivers, I think he could go for 20, 25 fantasy points. It's a good matchup. Houston gives up the 16th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. So they're middle of the pack, and I think Rivers has a solid game, and he's a good streaming option and definite 2 quarterback league start. So that's the top 15 quarterbacks I have ranked going into week 13.